Story 1. The room next door arrival at the hotel. Incredible setup. I had been driving for most of the day. The kind of long, quiet road trip where hours start blending together and every gas station begins to look the same. By the time the sun went down, I was already tired enough that I didn't want to push any farther. I pulled off the highway and found a small roadside hotel just outside a quiet town. It wasn't anything special. Just one of those two-story places with outside walkways and a dimly lit parking lot. But it looked clean, and honestly, at that point, I just needed somewhere to sleep. The lobby was calm when I walked in. A single employee sat behind the desk, scrolling through something on a computer. He checked me in quickly, handed me a key card, and pointed me toward a staircase near the end of the building. My room was on the second floor. The hallway outside was quiet. Not empty, exactly, but quiet in that strange hotel way where you know other people are around, even if you can't see them. Inside, the room looked completely normal. A bed, a small desk, a TV mounted on the wall. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and started unpacking a few things. That's when I heard the door to the room next to mine open. Footsteps. A suitcase wheel, dragging slightly across the floor. It sounded like someone else had just checked in. At the time, nothing about that seemed unusual. The strange pacing. Environmental unease. After unpacking a few things, I sat down on the edge of the bed and checked my phone for a while, mostly just trying to wind down from the drive. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioner in the corner. Then I started noticing the footsteps again from the room next door. At first it sounded normal, just someone moving around after checking in. The kind of slow walking you do when you're unpacking a suitcase or talking on the phone. I didn't really think much of it, but the footsteps didn't stop. Back and forth across the floor. A few seconds one direction, then a few seconds back the other way. At one point, one actually paused the video I was watching just to listen for a second. The rhythm was oddly steady. Not fast, not hurried. Just a slow, constant pacing across the same stretch of floor. I figured the person next door might be on a long call or maybe just restless after traveling. Still, it kept going. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe longer. The hallway outside my room stayed completely silent, which somehow made the sound through the wall even clearer. Back and forth, back and forth. After a while, I started realizing something that felt slightly off. Whoever was next door hadn't stopped pacing even once. Scratching on the wall, first anomaly. At some point, I must have drifted off for a little while, because when I checked my phone again, it was around 1:30 in the morning. That's when I noticed something different. The pacing had stopped. For the first time since I'd been in the room, the wall beside my bed was completely quiet. No footsteps, no movement. Just the steady hum of the air conditioner. The silence actually felt strange after hearing those footsteps for so long. A few minutes passed like that. Then I heard something else, a slow, scratching sound. At first it was faint, almost like someone shifting a piece of furniture across the floor. I sat up a little, listening carefully, trying to figure out what it was. The sound came again, long, slow, rough, like something dragging across the wall on the other side. I told myself it was probably just someone moving their suitcase or adjusting something near the wall. Hotels have thin walls, and sounds travel in weird ways sometimes. But then it happened again. Same place, same slow scraping motion. That's when I realized something that made me sit completely still. The scratching was coming from the exact spot where my bed was pressed against the wall, and it sounded close. Repeating noises, pattern reinforcement. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it started. For a moment, I just sat there in the dim light from my phone screen, listening to the wall beside the bed. Nothing moved, no footsteps. No sound at all from the room next door. I told myself it was probably just someone shifting furniture or maybe dragging a suitcase across the floor. Hotels are full of weird noises if you pay too much attention to them. Eventually I lay back down and tried to relax again. But maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, it happened again. The same slow scratching sound against the wall. Not loud, just close enough that I could hear it clearly through the drywall. It lasted maybe a minute or two, then stopped again. I started wondering if the person next door might be drunk or just pacing around their room moving things randomly. That would have explained the footsteps earlier. At one point, I even thought about calling the front desk, just to ask if someone could check on the room. But every time I reached that point, the sound would stop, and the silence that followed almost made me feel stupid for worrying about it at all. The knocking, escalation. Sometime later, I checked the time again. It was a little after 3 in the morning. I was still awake. The room next door had been quiet for a while, and I had almost convinced myself the whole thing was over. The scratching hadn't come back, and the hallway outside was completely silent. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Not on the door. On the wall, beside my bed. Slow, even, deliberate. I froze instantly. For a few seconds, I didn't move at all. I just stared at the wall in the dim light, trying to convince myself maybe it had been something else. Pipes in the wall, maybe. Or someone accidentally bumping into it. Then it happened again. 3 more knocks. Same exact rhythm. Each one landing almost exactly where my head was on the other side of the wall. I remember sitting there completely still, barely breathing, because something about it didn't feel random anymore. It felt intentional. And the strange part was the silence that followed. Whoever was next door didn't say anything. No footsteps. No movement. Just those knocks. And this uncomfortable feeling creeping in that whoever was in that room somehow knew exactly where I was sitting. Someone at the door. Peak threat moment. A few minutes passed after the knocking stopped. I stayed sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, half expecting those 3 knocks to come back again. But they didn't. Instead, I heard something out in the hallway. At first, it was just a faint shift of sound. The kind you notice when someone steps onto the walkway outside the rooms. Then there were footsteps. Slow ones. They moved along the hallway and stopped right outside my door. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for the light. Then I heard the door handle. A quiet click, followed by the handle slowly turning downward. Not hard, not aggressively, just enough to test the lock. The door didn't open, of course. It stayed firmly shut. But whoever was outside clearly tried. I sat there in the dark, completely still listening, waiting for footsteps to walk away. But for a few long seconds, the hallway stayed completely silent. Trying to explain it, rationalization attempt. Eventually the hallway went quiet again. No footsteps walking away. No voices. Just silence outside the door and the low hum of the air conditioner inside the room. After sitting there for a while, I started trying to make sense of it. The most reasonable explanation was that whoever was next door had simply gotten confused about their room number. Maybe they'd been drinking. Maybe they were tired from traveling and accidentally tried the wrong door. That would also explain the knocking earlier. I kept telling myself that was probably all it was. But even after lying back down, one thought kept bothering me. They hadn't knocked on my door first. The front desk answer, lingering uncertainty. The next morning, I casually asked the front desk about the room next to mine. The employee checked the system for a moment, then hesitated. He looked back at the screen and said something that made my stomach drop. That room hadn't been checked into the night before. The front desk answer, lingering uncertainty. The next morning, I casually asked the front desk about the room next to mine. The employee checked the system for a moment, then hesitated. He looked back at the screen and said something that made my stomach drop. That room hadn't been checked into the night before. Story 2, the bathroom light late night check-in. Credible setup. By the time I pulled into the hotel parking lot, it was already close to midnight. I'd been driving for most of the evening after finishing a work meeting in another city, and at that point I just needed somewhere quiet to sleep before continuing the trip the next morning. The hotel sat right off the highway, the kind of place you barely notice during the day, but somehow feels a little isolated at night. There were only a handful of cars in the parking lot, and most of the windows looked dark. Inside, the lobby was almost empty. A television behind the front desk played quietly while the clerk checked me in. He looked half awake, like he'd been working the night shift for hours already. The whole process took less than a minute. He handed me a key card and pointed toward a hallway that led to the rooms. No elevator, just a short walk down a quiet corridor. My room was near the end. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the light coming from the bathroom. It was already on, bright against the otherwise dim room. I figured housekeeping had just forgotten to turn it off. It didn't seem like a big deal. I dropped my bag on the chair, stepped into the bathroom, and flipped the switch. The light went out instantly. After that, I closed the door halfway, changed into something comfortable, and got into bed. Within minutes, the room was completely dark and quiet. Light turning on again, environmental unease. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up again. It wasn't a sudden wake up or anything dramatic. More like the kind of half awake moment you get in an unfamiliar room where your brain takes a second to remember where you are. At first, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. Then I noticed the light. A faint glow was spilling out from the bathroom door. For a moment, I was confused. The room had been completely dark when I fell asleep. But now the hallway of light stretched across the carpet again. The bathroom light was on. I sat up a little and looked toward the door, trying to remember if maybe I'd left it on by accident. But I clearly remembered flipping the switch before getting into bed. Still, it didn't seem like a big deal. Some hotel switches are loose or worn out. I figured maybe the switch hadn't fully clicked off the first time. So I got out of bed, walked across the room, and pushed the bathroom door open. The light was definitely on. I flipped the switch again, and the room went dark immediately. Then I stepped back into the bedroom, closed the door halfway again, and went back to bed, telling myself it was probably nothing. The door movement, first anomaly. Sometime later I woke up again. This time, it took a second longer for my eyes to adjust, but the first thing I noticed was the light. The bathroom light was on again. I stayed still for a moment, staring across the room. The glow from the bathroom stretched farther into the bedroom than before, cutting a pale strip across the carpet. Then I realized something else. The bathroom door was open wider. Not fully open, but definitely farther than where I'd left it. I remembered closing it halfway before getting back into bed. Now it was angled just enough that I could see part of the sink through the doorway. I sat up slowly, trying to replay the last few minutes in my head. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly. Maybe the air conditioning had pushed it open. Those were the kinds of explanations I was trying to stick with. Still, something about the way the light filled the room made it feel different this time. The hallway outside my room was completely silent, and the entire floor seemed empty. I kept looking at the doorway for a few seconds. For some reason, I had the strange feeling that if I walked over there again, the room might not look exactly the way I expected. The repeated pattern reinforcement. I got up again and walked over to the bathroom. The tile floor was cold under my feet, and the light inside the bathroom looked exactly the same as before. Nothing had moved, nothing looked disturbed. Just the sink, the mirror, the folded towels on the rack. I flipped the switch off. The light disappeared instantly. For a moment I stood there, staring at the switch like I expected it to move on its own. When nothing happened, I stepped back into the bedroom and pulled the door halfway closed again. Then I went back to bed. This time it took longer for me to fall asleep. I kept listening to the quiet of the room, the occasional hum of the air conditioner starting and stopping. Eventually I must have drifted off again. But at some point later in the night, I opened my eyes and immediately noticed the glow. The bathroom light was on. Again, I didn't move right away. I just lay there staring at the door, trying to decide if I should get up or ignore it. A faulty switch was the only explanation that made sense. Still, after the third time, it was getting harder to pretend it was nothing. Movement inside the bathroom. Escalation. I stayed in bed that time. The bathroom light was still on, spilling across the floor, but I didn't feel like getting up again just to flip the switch. At that point, I was more tired than anything else, and I kept telling myself it was probably just a faulty switch or old wiring. Hotels are full of small maintenance issues like that. So I turned onto my side and tried to ignore it. For a while, nothing happened. The room stayed quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Then I heard something. A faint sound coming from the bathroom. At first, it was so subtle I wasn't even sure I'd heard it correctly. It sounded like something lightly brushing against the floor. Not loud. Just a soft dragging noise, like fabric shifting across tile. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound came again. Slow, quiet, almost careful. It wasn't constant, though. Just small movements separated by long pauses. For a moment, I considered getting up again to check. But something about the quiet way the sound moved across the bathroom floor made me hesitate, because it didn't sound like a light switch malfunction anymore. The door slowly opens. Peak threat moment. I stayed lying there, staring at the bathroom door. The light was still on, casting a soft glow across the floor, and the room around me felt completely still. I told myself the sound I heard earlier could have been the air conditioner turning on or maybe something settling in the pipes. Then the door moved. It didn't swing open quickly. It shifted slowly, almost quietly, like it had been nudged from the inside. The gap widened just a little. I felt my body go completely still. From where I was lying, I could see more of the bathroom now. The edge of the sink, part of the mirror, the pale tile floor reflecting the light, but nothing moved inside. The door continued to open slightly until it stopped on its own. And for some reason, I didn't get out of bed to check. I just stayed there watching the doorway, waiting to see if something else inside that room would move, trying to rationalize it. Rationalization attempt. After a few minutes of staring at the doorway, I forced myself to think about it logically. The door probably hadn't been closed all the way. If the latch wasn't fully set, the air conditioner turning on could have pushed it open a little. Air pressure does strange things in hotel rooms sometimes. That explanation made enough sense that I started to calm down. The light switch earlier could still be a wiring issue too. Older buildings have problems like that all the time. Eventually, I turned onto my side and tried to ignore the bathroom completely, but I didn't turn the light off again. For some reason, I didn't want to walk back into that room. The hotel response, lingering uncertainty. The next morning, I mentioned the light and the door to the front desk. Later that afternoon, maintenance checked the room. According to them, the switch worked perfectly. No wiring issues, no loose connections. Nothing that could explain why the light kept turning on during the night. Story 3. The man in the hallway conference trip arrival. Credible setup. I was traveling alone for a work conference, something I had done plenty of times before. Most of those trips followed the same routine long drive, quick hotel check-in, then a quiet night before a meeting start the next morning. This hotel was in the middle of downtown, surrounded by office buildings and restaurants that had already started closing for the night by the time I arrived. When I first walked into the lobby, it was still fairly busy. A few other guests were checking in, and someone was talking to the front desk about a reservation problem. It felt like a normal hotel atmosphere, nothing unusual about it. By the time I finished checking in and took the elevator upstairs, though, everything had gotten noticeably quieter. The hallway on my floor felt long and almost empty. Most of the doors were closed with no light underneath them. Only a few rooms had that faint glow slipping out from the bottom of door that tells you someone inside is still awake. My room was near the middle of the corridor. Inside, everything looked exactly like you'd expect from a standard business hotel. Clean bed, small desk, a chair by the window. I set my bag down, plugged my phone into the charger, and laid out a few things for the conference in the morning. At that point, the hotel felt completely normal. Just another quiet night in another unfamiliar room. Someone standing in the hallway. Environmental unease. A little later that evening, I realized I'd forgotten to grab water for the night, so I stepped out of the room to find the ice machine down the hallway. The corridor was even quieter than before, the kind of silence where you can hear your own footsteps against the carpet. The ice machine was near the elevator at the far end of the hall. As I was walking back toward my room, I noticed someone standing farther down the corridor. A man. He was near the corner where the hallway turned, just standing there beside the wall. Not knocking on a door or using his phone, just standing still. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hotels are full of people trying to remember their room numbers or waiting for someone else to come back. So I kept walking and unlocked my door. But before going inside, I glanced once more down the hallway. He hadn't moved. After I stepped into my room and locked the door, I happened to look at the small hallway monitor, mounted near the elevator through the partially open doorway. The camera showed the same stretch of corridor, and the man was still standing in exactly the same spot. The first anomaly. Around midnight, I was still awake, answering a few emails and reviewing notes for the conference the next morning. The room was quiet enough that every small sound felt noticeable. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft taps against the door. For a second, I thought maybe it had come from somewhere else in the hallway. But the sound had been close, definitely my door. I waited, listening for a voice or another knock. Nothing came. After a moment, I stood up and walked over slowly. leaning toward the peephole. The hallway outside looked completely empty. The dim overhead lights stretched down the corridor, but there was no one standing near my door. I stayed there for a few seconds just watching. Still nothing. Eventually, I unlocked the door and opened it slightly, just enough to look out. The hallway was silent. Most of the doors were closed, and the few rooms with lights under the doors looked undisturbed. No footsteps, no voices. I stepped back inside and closed the door again, telling myself someone had probably knocked on the wrong room and walked away. The repeated visits, pattern reinforcement. Maybe 20 minutes passed before it happened again. Another knock. 3 soft taps against the door. This time, I didn't move right away. I stayed where I was sitting on the bed, listening carefully to the silence that followed. No footsteps. No voices in the hallway. After a few seconds, I walked slowly back to the door and leaned toward the peephole. The space directly outside my room was empty again. But when I looked farther down the corridor, toward the end where the hallway turned, I noticed something that made me pause. The same man was standing there. He was partly hidden near the corner, just visible enough under the hallway lights that I could recognize the shape of someone standing against the wall. He wasn't moving, just standing there like before. I couldn't tell if he had knocked on my door, or if he had simply been lingering in the hallway again. From that distance, it was impossible to be sure. Still, something about seeing him there a second time made this situation feel different. I stayed looking through the peephole longer than I meant to. For some reason, I had the uneasy feeling that if I opened the door, he might already be walking toward it. The whisper through the door, escalation. It was sometime after 2 in the morning when the knocking came back. This time, it sounded a little closer to the center of the door. The same 3 soft taps, spaced out just enough that they didn't feel accidental. Before I could even move, I heard a voice outside, quiet, almost like someone speaking through the door instead of directly at it. Hotel staff. Just checking rooms. The voice sounded low and uncertain, like the person saying it wasn't used to saying those words. I stayed where I was and didn't answer right away. Something about it didn't feel right. Most hotel employees announce themselves clearly. They knock once or twice, say front desk or housekeeping, and move on if no one responds. This voice just lingered there. After a moment, I quietly picked up the room phone and called the front desk. When someone answered, I asked if they had sent anyone to my room. There was a pause on the other end. Then the employee said something that made my chest tighten. No, he said. We didn't send anyone upstairs. The door handle movement, peak threat moment. After the call ended, the room felt even quieter than before. I stood there for a moment with the phone still in my hand, listening for any sound outside the door. The hallway had gone completely silent again. Then, a few minutes later, I heard it. The door handle moved, not suddenly, not violently. Just a slow turn, like someone gently testing the lock. The metal clicked softly and stopped. My body froze. I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I reached over and turned off the lamp beside the bed, letting the room fall into darkness. For a few seconds, nothing else happened. No knocking, no voice. Just the faint pressure on the handle as if someone on the other side was checking to see if the door might give. Eventually, the handle shifted back into place. I stayed completely still, waiting for footsteps to move away down the hallway. Trying to make sense of it. Rationalization attempt. Eventually, the hallway went quiet again. I waited several minutes before turning the lamp back on, listening carefully for any sound outside the door. There were no footsteps, no voices, nothing moving in the corridor anymore. I tried to convince myself the man had probably been drunk or confused about his room. Hotels get plenty of guests who wander the wrong floor late at night. That explanation made the most sense, even if it didn't completely settle my nerves. After that, I locked the door again, slid the security latch into place, and decided I wasn't leaving the room until morning, no matter what else I heard outside. The security footage, lingering uncertainty. The next morning, I mentioned the situation to the front desk. They checked the hallway cameras from the night before. After a few minutes, the manager came back looking confused. According to the footage, no one had been standing in that hallway at all during the time I described. Story 4. The locked floor, the unexpected. Room assignment. Credible setup. I arrived at the hotel a little after 11 that night, already worn out from a long day of driving. It was one of those large city hotels with multiple floors and a wide, polished lobby that looked far more active during the day than it did at night. When I walked in, the place was almost empty. The front desk clerk greeted me, checked my reservation, and, while handing over the key card, mentioned that the hotel was unusually quiet that week. Apparently, some event that usually filled most of the rooms had been canceled. Because of that, he said he could upgrade my room to a higher floor. At the time, it sounded like a nice bonus. I took the key card and headed to the elevators. The ride up was quiet. The soft hum of the elevator, the only sound in the hallway when the doors finally opened. The floor I stepped onto felt strangely dim. Only a few ceiling lights were on, leaving long sections of the corridor in soft shadows. As I walked toward my room, I noticed several doors with no light underneath them. Like most of the floor wasn't being used at all. It felt empty. But at that point, I just assumed everyone else was asleep. The elevator stops. Environmental unease. After settling into the room, I left the door slightly open while I brought my bag inside. The hallway outside stayed quiet, the kind of silence that feels normal in a mostly empty hotel. A few minutes later, I heard the elevator. The soft mechanical hum carried down the corridor as it moved up through the building. When it reached my floor, the doors opened for a moment. Then they closed again. No footsteps followed. No voices. Just the elevator continuing upward. At first, I assumed someone had stepped off quietly, or maybe another guest had called it from a higher floor. But it happened again about 10 minutes later. The elevator arrived at my floor, opened briefly, then continued moving without anyone appearing in the hallway. Curious, I stepped out of my room and looked toward the far end of the corridor. The elevator doors had already closed again, and the hallway was completely empty. Footsteps in the hall, first anomaly. Later that night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were faint at first, the kind of sound you barely notice through a hotel door. But after a few seconds, it became clearer. Someone was walking slowly down the corridor outside my room. The steps weren't hurried, just steady, moving along the carpeted hallway. I figured it was another guest heading back to their room. The footsteps passed my door and continued farther down the hall. Then they stopped. I waited a moment, expecting to hear a door open or close somewhere nearby. But nothing happened. After a few seconds of silence, I got up and walked over to the door, leaning toward the peephole. The hallway lights were still dim, stretching across the empty corridor. There was no one there. No movement. No open doors. Just the same quiet hallway I had seen earlier. The late night knock. Pattern reinforcement. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a soft knock. It wasn't loud enough to startle me fully awake. Just a light tap against the door. The kind that almost makes you wonder if you imagined it. I stayed still for a moment, listening. Then it came again. A quiet knock, just a little firmer this time. I sat up in bed and looked toward the door, trying to decide if it had actually come from my room or somewhere else in the hallway. After a few seconds, I got up and walked over to the door, leaning toward the peephole. The hallway outside looked exactly the same as before. Dim overhead lights, long empty carpet. No one standing near the door. I stayed there watching for a moment, expecting someone to step out from one of the nearby rooms. But nothing moved. Eventually I stepped back, assuming someone must have knocked on the wrong door and walked away before I reached it. The elevator opens again. Escalation. A few minutes after I went back to bed, I heard the elevator again. The sound carried clearly down the quiet hallway. The mechanical hum slowed, then the doors opened with that soft sliding noise you hear in every hotel. I lay there for a second, listening. Then I heard footsteps. Faint at first, but definitely moving along the hallway. The steps were slow, steady, coming from the direction of the elevator. They sounded like they were heading toward my end of the corridor. I sat up, waiting to hear a door open somewhere nearby. Instead, the footsteps stopped. Right outside my room, for a moment, everything went completely silent. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the door, leaning toward the peephole again. The hallway lights were still dim. The elevator doors at the far end were already closed. And the corridor outside my room was completely empty. The empty hallway peak threat moment. After staring through the peephole for a few seconds, I slowly unlocked the door. I opened it just enough to look into the hallway. The corridor was completely empty. The carpet stretched out in both directions under the dim ceiling lights, and none of the nearby doors were open. There were no footsteps, no voices, nothing moving anywhere along the floor. For a moment, I stepped 1 foot into the hallway and looked toward the elevator. That's when I noticed something strange. The elevator doors at the far end were still open, not closing. Just sitting there, like someone had stepped out only seconds earlier. I stood there listening, half expecting someone to appear from around the corner. But the hallway stayed perfectly silent. The hotel explanation, rationalization attempt, the next morning, while checking out, I mentioned the footsteps in the elevator stopping on my floor. The front desk clerk listened politely and then gave a simple explanation. Apparently, that floor had been mostly closed that week because of maintenance. Only a few rooms were being used. He said the elevator sometimes stopped automatically on floors, even when no one was there. At the time, that explanation sounded reasonable enough. The keycard log, lingering uncertainty. Later that day, I received a call from the hotel manager. They had checked the keycard records from that night. Someone had accessed the hallway door to my floor around 2 in the morning. The strange part was no guests had been assigned to any room on that floor.